This presentation is about my personal journey as an artist. I had a very left-brain, technical, and science-oriented career, and for me, art has been an avocation, but also something that I really needed to have in my life. I started doing artwork in the mid-1980s in response to a deep feeling that something was missing in my life, and I knew that it had something to do with art. I began my art quest by getting this book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. And kind of a miracle happened. One of the most important exercises in the book is to do a right side up drawing of a picture, and then to draw the same picture upside down and compare the two. The upside down drawing is always better because your brain doesn't interfere as much by trying to name and model what you see. Instead, you're able to see abstract lines, shapes, and their spatial relationships to each other clearly, so you can draw them more accurately. On the right side is my upside down drawing of the picture on the left, and it made me think that I could do this. So shortly after, I took 2 semesters of a drawing class. These are a couple of examples of my student drawings. The one on the right is from a life drawing session. Some of my first drawings were photos of my family. I had lost both my parents when I was in my mid-20s, so I was always thinking of them and still grieving, even after many years had passed. This is a drawing of a photo with my father on the right, taken in California shortly before he shipped off to combat in Europe in World War II. I always admired botanical and nature drawings, so this was an experiment with kind of a surreal landscape. Drawing class also introduced me to pastels, and this is a pastel of a goat with a mythological horned god in the background. So at some point, I became quite interested in my family heritage, which is Polish and Slovak. And after a trip to Eastern Europe and Slovakia, I was inspired to create this. This is my first mixed media image where I combine pastel with printing. So before I go on, I want to talk briefly about my printing process. Here's a photo of some of my print blocks that I carved over the years. The blue one near the center is the one that I used in the first piece. The print blocks that I use are cut from Speedball Speedy Cut. They're soft, rubbery, and easy to cut, and you can use both sides. This photo also shows the cutting tool with attachments and a roller for applying paint. Although now I often don't use the roller, I just use a paintbrush. Speedball does make some special printing paints, but now I just use regular acrylics. Printing with these blocks can be a really messy, random process because I never know how the print is going to turn out. Sometimes it's perfect and sometimes it needs a lot of touching up, but that's okay. Following the first piece, which I considered a prototype, I eventually did an 18-piece mixed media series, which I called Goddesses and Ancestors. And most of these were done on colored paper, about 21 by 29 inches in size. This is a portrait of my Slovak grandmother when she first immigrated to America at the age of 18. On her chest are images of my mother as an infant, me as a young woman, and her as my grandma. I surrounded her with folk embroidery motifs. This next one is a portrait of my Polish grandmother, who died before I was born. My father is the baby on her knee, and I placed a Polish Pieta, or sorrowful mother image behind her, as she lost 3 of her children, including very sadly the older boy in the picture. She is surrounded by a border of Polish folk paper cut motifs. This is my tree of life. And this one I called Slavic Mother, and I showed her in several other works from the series in an earlier presentation, Goddesses, Heroines, and Creatures, A Heritage of Female Imagery in Art, which I gave last month. So this one is called The Primordial Spirit of Motherhood, and it's a portrait of a mother gorilla who actively protected and saved a 3-year-old child from the other apes after he fell 20 feet into their zoo enclosure in 1996. As the child was lying on the ground, she cradled him, picked him up, and carried him to a door where rescuers waited as the crowd looked on. There were 6 other gorillas in the exhibit at the time, and she carried her own baby on her back throughout her encounter with the boy, which made many think this may have contributed to her maternal instincts to rescue the child. In the next 2 works, I wanted to experiment with Asian motifs. This first one is called The Tao of Loss. And this one is called The Book of Changes. And it's the last piece in the series. So at that point, I stopped doing artwork for an extended period. And when I started again, I didn't take up printing again right away, but rather did some straightforward pastels. And I also started painting with oils, but in sort of a sketchy way. This pastel is called Morning Meditation, and I've included photos of Meso and Native American images that I incorporated in the image. And this one's called Ambivalent Passage. The photo mock-up on the left incorporates a sculpture from the Met in New York City and a photo of a doorway that I took in India. And this one, my painting on the right is called Dream Spiral, and on the left are the images I incorporated, which were all taken at museums in New York. On the left is the beautiful artwork, Morning Victory, by the great American sculptor Daniel Chester French, and it adorns the Melvin Family Memorial at a cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts. It was commissioned in 1897 by James Melvin to commemorate the loss of his 3 brothers in the Civil War. I'm only familiar with this work because there's a copy at the Met in New York. On the right is my version, and I imagined her underwater surrounded by water lilies. Another cemetery image that I really liked is this beautiful tombstone at the Rock Creek Cemetery in DC that says, "Out with the ebb tide on some farther quest." I especially like the 2 figures in the center, and I wanted to do something with them. So I turned them towards each other and called this piece All of Creation. Both this and Morning Victory are large pieces, the largest pieces I've ever painted, and they're at least 3 by 4 feet. Here's the last piece from my unnamed series of oil paintings based on sculptures or reliefs, and this one is called Watch at the Night Portal. The sculpture that it's based on, shown upper left, was from Asia, maybe Indonesia, I'm not sure, but I did see it at the Art Institute of Chicago. So I had one more idea along these lines that I never executed. There's this wonderful 1914 sculpture by Lorando Taft at the Art Institute of Chicago called Solitude of the Soul. So along with photos of that sculpture, I collected a few other images that I thought I might somehow use. Anyway, these are like remnants of a phantom artwork that never happened. So as a geologist, I've always been interested in rocks and fossils. So I have several artworks focused on that. This pastel is called Strata of Earth and Sky. This acrylic painting, which I called Fallen, centers on a pterosaur fossil. It is also my first experiment incorporating thicker paint media. I created textures using various molding pastes, and on the left side you can see the effect of the crackle paste. Here's some examples of the type of media. So my painting on the right here is called Windows on Ancient Waters, and on the left is the inspiration, a photo of a fossil of an Eocene fish, and also the print blocks that I cut for this piece. These are 2 oil paintings showing microscopic views of mineral structures. The titles are Crystal Illumination on the left and Healing Blue Crystals on the right. I especially love photomicrographs of rocks, and these 2 slides show photomicrographs on the left and my paintings inspired by them on the right. The painting here is called Internal Structure, and this one is called Jazz Intersection. Besides geology and art, I've also had a big interest in archaeology. Photo on the left shows ancient sculptures from Mexico, and on the right is my version in pastel. This is a small painting called Cypriot Bird. It's based on the ancient pottery image shown on the lower left, which is actually at the Met in New York City. The print block that I used for it is shown upper left, and this was created using a polyprint sheet, which I'll talk about more about in a bit as I used it extensively in later works. This painting is called Windows on Ancient Mysteries. It was primarily painted using acrylic paints, and the figures were printed using polyprint sheets. And this one, called Ancient Mexico, was created using the same technique. This is my burial mound, and it was created using a lot of small scale printing and also embossing hard molding paste using print blocks in the white areas. I found that sprinkling powder on the molding paste before embossing prevented the blocks from sticking to it. A trip to Greece resulted in several blue paintings. This is a triptych of ancient Cycladic figures. And this one I called Cycladic Dream Landscape. And this was a triptych I called Crystal Blue Horizon. When I lived in the West, I often flew over a landscape that looked like this Google image over Scott, Kansas, and I found these visuals very fascinating. So returning to print, big time, I created these next three pieces. This one I called Harmony of Earth and Moon. And this is Dawn of the Spheres. Next, I decided to scale up a bit, and I created this piece I called Cultivate the Desert. So on works like these, this is how I did the larger prints. I used speedball polyprint printing foam plates. They come in 9 by 12 inch sheets. It's very easy to use. They have an adhesive back that I stick to foam board, and then the plate can be cut to size with an X-Acto knife and embossed using tools like those shown here. After printing, the plates can be gently cleaned and reused many times. But same as printing with the blocks, the process can be messy and the printed results can be variable. So sometimes a lot of touching up is still required. Most of my most recent paintings are 24 by 30 inches. They're done on canvas board or else gessoed masonite rather than framed canvas because I need a firm surface to print on. And then to hang them, I use metal frames, which I assemble myself. So Cultivate the Desert was the first of a series of 6 paintings, which I call tiles. These paintings are all the same size, 24 by 30 inches. This piece is called Ancient Ones, as the next in the series. And here's some images that I used to develop the painting. The petroglyphs shown lower right, I photographed those near Arches National Park in Utah. So here's a photo of the embossed polyprint plates, some preliminary sketches, and the paint samples for developing the palette. So this one I call Dinosaur Ridge. It's based on a place in Colorado where you can see actual dinosaur footprints in the sandstone. My overall concept in this tile series was to take an environment where there are many, many things to look at and break it down into just a few individual images of interesting things and arrange them. So here's some images I used in developing this composition. Okay, this next painting is called Winter Migration, and long before I painted it, I had written a poem inspired by geese that used to fly by my office window. Cool blue and white, outside my window, the winter sky is ever changing. A sudden V of geese glides overhead, so close, I can see their eyes, so close, I can feel the plump pallets of their feathers lifting me up. But so quickly they are gone. and I am stranded. So these are some images that I just found on the web that helped me with the composition of that last piece. So I love to go to the shore, and I'm fascinated by the subtle patterns and almost minimalist imagery of the beach. So I use these images to construct this next piece, which I called Arranged by the Tide. So last in the tile series is Desert Spring. It was inspired by Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, a magical place in Nevada located between Death Valley and Las Vegas. And long before I did this painting, I wrote a short poem about this place. Unexpected translucent pool, rare window, mysterious jewel, water, a blue spirit rising from a deeper silent world, clear warm current stirring with an earthly rhythm all its own. This next piece I called Reaching for the Waves was an attempt to apply the print plates created for the tiles pieces in a more abstract way. So at one point, I became friends with a very prominent marine archaeologist, and I was inspired to do a couple of pastels of shipwrecks. I called the one on the left Rest in Blue Silence, and on the right, Deep Blue Memory. Then I did this acrylic printed painting called Shipwreck Debris Field. The blue-green squares represent a sequence of survey scans that marine archaeologists use to study a shipwreck. This was actually the first underpainting attempt for the previous work, but I felt that it was too strong to paint over, so I left it as a standalone painting, turned it 90 degrees, and called it the Ice Cave. It was printed using one on-carved print block. I applied the paint to the block in variable ways, and the printed results were uncontrollable but interesting, so I left them as is with no touch-up. So at this point I started experimenting with abstract painting, and this one is called Cosmic Love. This is another abstract that started out as an underpainting, but I liked it so much that, again, I decided just to leave it alone, and I call it Organic. So I painted it again, and this time added the intended overlay, and this one I called Affinity. And this one is titled Apollo. I used both printing and masking. Returning to my love of geology and the stratigraphic layering of rocks, I painted this one called Stratigraphic Horizons. And it was followed by this more beach-oriented one called Stratigraphic Horizons 2, in which I again experimented with thick media. This one is called The Ice is Melting. It reflects my concern about climate change, and it uses a combination of printing, abstract brushwork, and thick media. And I called this abstract printed work Postcards from the Beach. So on the left is this sort of out-of-control painting called Blue Field Connections, which I later painted over using a masking technique and renamed Gaining Perspective. One thing that I've become very interested in recently is looking for patterns and interesting images in unexpected places, something that could be called happenstantial art. In some cases, these images can be cropped and used as inspirations for artworks, as in this case. These random pine needles that I observed in Florida inspired the piece on the right, which I called Hope Emerging. The photo on the left was taken on a fishing pier, and it inspired the work to the right, which I never named. Actually, I have not gotten around to naming most of the following pieces. To create a lot of my more recent pieces, I often use masking. Besides using an assortment of artist tapes, I really like to use Frisket film, which is like a tape, except it's a sheet that you can cut into any shape or size. And I also find tracing paper to be handy when using the film. So the piece on the right required considerable masking and touch-up because the tape and the friskets sometimes leak. To get a nice even paint surface, I applied paint to larger areas using a roller. The painting was inspired by the photo on the left of a place in Iceland that I actually just saw this on Facebook. And this piece on the right, called Shelter, was inspired by the photo on the left. And I saw this interesting image on TV of World War I trenches as viewed from the air. And I thought it was so interesting that I paused it and I took the photo. So during COVID, I became very interested in Art Deco. And this is an Art Deco inspired piece that started out as an underpainting. But once again, I decided to stop painting and just leave it as is. To create this image, I used masking tape and again applied the paint with a roller. And this rather large piece is 2 by 4 feet, and it's a printed work inspired by the Art Deco metalwork on the left. Another piece that I achieved with extensive masking and some printing in the background. For this one, I used a thick medium hard molding paste to create all the white structure, and then the colors were added later. And this is just a pastel experiment. So this is a triptych that I did for one of our bedrooms. And so they're actually individually framed and they're not presented this way. This is just, I mocked this up in PowerPoint. Again, I used tape and frisket film were used, and the paint was applied with a roller. So this one's just an experiment utilizing some small printing blocks and also a sponge for printing the dappled areas. So for these experiments and also for drafts, I like to use various sized canvas sheets that come in a pad. And this is just done on a canvas sheet. The photo on the right that I took of a cantaloupe inspired the experiment on the left. And I experimented briefly with using fluid paints. For this painting, the white paint was drizzled on first, and then the print was added, and finally the color. Another experiment with fluid paint, this is actually a finished piece, and this time I used black paint and a background of silver and gold with block printed symbols. To illustrate the process, this is a photo of the piece before the metallic paints were added. So I started by drizzling the fluid black paint, then added the print before the colors. So recently I've experimented with the idea of painting totems, and this was my first one. Outside the 2 totem poles, there is a blue underpainting overlain by a thin coat of white paint, which was applied using a single on-carved print block. To create a variety of print patterns, I first applied the white paint to the block, then used a tool to draw patterns into it before printing. And this was my first named painting in a long time. I call this one my bird goddess totem. And because I can never seem to stop trying new things, here's another recent experiment. The image on the left shows an earlier stage of the experiment on the right. And this finished piece I call the sun totem, and it uses the same technique. And this is my latest work, which again is pretty different. So before closing, I just want to show a few random things. For years I made my own Christmas cards, and for these 2 I created a design using pastel, and then I had the cards printed. This is my self-portrait from a few years ago, created using a poly print based on the photo. I'm not a serious photographer, but I enjoy taking photos for inspiration, so I'm going to show a few. These first 4 have interesting shadows and light. And I love capturing ephemeral light fairies, which sometimes appear on the wall and only last a few minutes. And I run and get my camera. Reflections in water are always good. Rainbows that occur at any time, and these are in condensation drops on a wine glass. Colorful ginkgo leaves on brick. Cut cabbage. Reflections on a lake at dusk. And the amazing light and colors of the Atlantic Ocean at dusk. So the intense beauty of this image and many things that I happen to come across in life can sometimes grip me so strongly that I actually feel it physically, often in my chest. So for me, art is primarily a way to deal with those feelings, images, and ideas that affect me in some way, and often unexpectedly so. It allows me to spend time with them, exploring their mystery, and sometimes watching them morph into something else altogether. So as both a process and an experience, for me, art is mainly about the freedom to explore. Thanks for listening.